The Accu-Wedge is an accessory carriage for the Accu-Slice system for the cutting of the wedges used to produce segmented rings on the bandsaw. In this video I'm going to discuss the selection of the bandsaw blade for use with the Accu-Wedge system. The selection of the bandsaw blade is critical for the proper operation of the Accu-Wedge to ensure smooth cuts with tight joints in the segmented rings and no gaps between any of the joints. In my previous videos on the operation of the Accu-Slice system, I've been using 1/2 inch wide wood bandsaw blades with 6 to 10 teeth per inch. Using these 1/2 inch wide blades on the Accu-Slice system, we demonstrated that one can obtain perfect straight cuts while obtaining no blade drift. In my initial setup and testing of the Accu-Wedge system itself with the Accu-Slice table and rail, I initially installed a 1/2 inch wide bandsaw blade with 14 teeth per inch and normal blade tension set on a blade tension gauge. I then made a number of segmented rings using some MDF strips. I made rings going all the way from 5 segments per ring all the way up to 36 segments per ring. All the joints in these rings were perfect with no gaps between any of the segments, proving that the Accu-Wedge system worked perfectly with the auto-indexing table. However, when I made some segmented rings with wood strips, I noticed some minor gaps in the joints. These gaps were minor and would probably not have been an issue if I glued the segments up in half ring sections and then sanded the half rings before gluing them together to form a finished ring. But the rings were not perfect. Upon some further experimentation, I determined that it was the wood grain that was causing the bandsaw blade to drift ever so slightly when I cut at an oblique angle across the grain of the wood. As we've demonstrated in our previous videos, there's no blade drift when cutting with the grain or 90 degrees across the grain using the Accu-Slice bandsaw system. However, when cutting at an angle across the wood grain, the bandsaw blade was exhibiting some variation in resistance on the opposite sides of the cut as it cut at this oblique angle between 20 and 70 degrees, and this caused the bandsaw blade to drift ever so slightly. I increased the bandsaw blade tension to what I would normally use for a 3/4 inch bandsaw blade, and the cuts were much improved with no visible gap between the joints. However, I was uncomfortable using this increased blade tension on the 1/2 inch bandsaw blades. This might cause the blade to prematurely break at the weld joint in the bandsaw blade. In order to better understand what's happening with our 1/2 inch blades and why we're seeing some blade drift using a 1/2 inch blade to make these wood segments, I put together this model. And in this model, these sticks which I glued together represent the grain of the wood. When we're cutting parallel to the grain of the wood, we see no blade drift. When we cut exactly perpendicular to the grain of the wood, we see no blade drift. But when we cut at this angle to the grain, we're seeing blade drift. So the question is, why are we seeing this small amount of blade drift? And this model shows kind of the reason why we're seeing that. We're cutting on this side of the cut, we're cutting in a down position to the grain of the wood. Whereas when we're cutting on this side of the grain of the wood, we're cutting on the upside of the grain of the wood. So we're going to see more resistance on this side of the cut than we will on this side of the cut. And because there's more resistance on this side, the blade's going to tend to drift to the side of least resistance. And that's when we get our segments, you know, the blade drifts a little bit to the outside of the cut, and the board will be a little bit smaller than we expected. And that's why when we get our finished cuts using a 1/2 inch blade, I see this small amount of gap on the outside of the segments. I went to the Timberwolf bandsaw blade website to search out a 3/4 inch wide blade. In searching the website, I found some 3/4 inch wide by 14 teeth per inch woodworking bandsaw blades, but the shortest blade length that they listed was 127 inches long, too long for my bandsaw. I did notice that Timberwolf offered some metal cutting blades that were 3/4 inch wide with a 10 to 14 variable tooth design that would fit my bandsaw. These blades are 3/4 inch wide, and they're also slightly thicker than a normal woodworking bandsaw blade. These are 35 thousandths inch thick versus 25 thousandths for my 1/2-inch woodworking bandsaw blades. So these blades would be much stronger because they're not only wider, but they're also thicker, and they'd be less likely to exhibit any bandsaw blade drift. I installed one of these bandsaw blades on my Laguna bandsaw, and I proceeded to make some segmented rings. I cut a number of segmented rings, going all the way from 6 up to 32 segments per ring. And these are a few examples of some rings that I made. This is 18 segments per ring, again perfect joints. And this is 24 segments per ring, again perfect joints. These are some unique things that you can do on the bandsaw. It'd be very difficult to do on a table saw. I can actually cut my wedges to a perfect point to make nice discs that might make a nice bottom of a bowl. Here's one of my laminated strips I made into a 6-segment ring, and again this will make a nice bottom for one of my bowls. However, my preference would be to use a wood cutting bandsaw blade with a set of 14 teeth per inch. When I cut this wedges on the metal cutting blade, the cuts were pretty good. A little bit of some marks on there, but good enough for gluing. But I think a standard wood cutting blade might give me a better finish. I contacted Timberwolf, and they were able to provide me with a standard 3/4 inch wide by 14 teeth per inch wood cutting blade to fit my Laguna bandsaw. This new blade is 3/4 inch wide by 32 thousandths inch thick, has a kerf of 49 thousandths of an inch. So I'm now going to install this bandsaw blade on my Laguna bandsaw and proceed to make some segmented rings. I installed the 3/4 inch, 14 teeth per inch bandsaw blade on my bandsaw, and I installed my Accu-Wedge on the Accu-Slice table. But before I proceed, it's important you check the blade to make sure it's perfectly perpendicular to your table. A lot of variables. You have your table, you have your Accu-Slice system, you have your Accu-Wedge system. Anything could be out of hair, and it'd be important to get this perfectly perpendicular. So I just put a square in there, and if it needs adjustment, I need to get underneath the table and adjust my bandsaw blade to get that perfectly perpendicular. I may be in the future doing some special cuts where I'm going to create an angle and cut some boards at an angle, but for most of my work I'm going to want this to be perfectly perpendicular. So that's good, it's set down. I can lower my blade guides down closer to my work surface. Again, to get closer I get that to my work surface, the safer the cut will be, and you want to keep your fingers far away from that blade at all times. Now I'm ready to start cutting my boards. I have a piece of walnut here, which I'm going to be making some segments. I have my stop set, and what I'm trying to do is get perfect segments that come to a point so there's no gap in the center of my segmented ring. So now I've cut my segments, so we'll take a look at some of these. Cuts are fairly smooth. You do get this burr on the end of the cut on some of the boards where it kicks out of the into the bandsaw blade. So that needs to be sanded off. Surface is fairly smooth, probably about the same as the metal cutting blade. I don't see much difference. But we do have fuzzies on the end here, again, need to be sanded off. And I'll show that next, how we sand these very lightly to get rid of these edges and the fuzzies. I have a piece of maple here, the exact same dimension as that piece of walnut I just cut. And I want to make segments of alternating maple and walnut. So let's go ahead and cut this board to make the adjoining sets of segments. The first thing I do is get my first cut. Now you do notice in those cuts, I'm going fairly slow through the bandsaw blade. And I'm purposely doing that because the slower your cut, the better your finish. So, and also less chance of blade drift. But mainly the main reason is just to get nice smooth cuts, you want to go fairly slowly. So it's each of the pieces that were cut, again, fairly smooth cut, good enough for gluing. You see this edge here, perfect points on these edges. I make a nice tight center on my segmented ring. On every other piece I get this small burr again, which needs to be sanded off. And we do get fuzzies on the edge also, which need to be sanded off. So I'll show that next. Okay, I'm ready to sand my segments. And this is nothing more than a piece of 220 grit sandpaper. And I have my wedges with my fuzzies and a small burr I got to sand off. And all I do is just slightly sand these to get rid of that burr, get rid of the fuzzies. And that's really all that's required to clean that up. And I just repeat that to the other segments. I'm going to be alternating the maple and walnut for my segment ring. So I do the same thing on the maple pieces. And again, nice clean segments. And when these are joined together, I'll have a pattern looking like that. After finishing sanding all the disc, assembling into two segmented patterns, alternating woods, putting a rubber band around them, and I have two segmented disc with perfect joints, meeting perfectly in the center. This will make a nice bottom for a bowl. Lastly, I want to cover a few safety issues in using the Accu-Wedge system on the bandsaw. The bandsaw can be a dangerous tool because you have a blade moving at fairly high speed and exposed to your wood and your work area. So you got to be careful you keep your fingers far removed from that bandsaw blade at all times. That's why we've made these clamps, so you can clamp your wood to the fence and then keep your fingers far removed from that bandsaw blade as you're cutting through the board. Next thing, you want to make sure you keep your blade guard as low as possible. The lower you keep that to your work, the less exposure you're going to have above the work area that you might come in contact with that blade. I've actually made an additional guard for my bandsaw blade. This is nothing more than a piece of aluminum which has been bent and some magnets attached to it that attaches to my blade guard here to give me additional coverage of my blade to minimize the exposure of that blade. The last thing I've done, I've installed a laser beam which projects the path of the bandsaw blade on the work that I'm going to be cutting. Again, that makes sure that my finger is going to be far removed from that area because I can see exactly where it's cutting. This laser mark will be available very shortly. In conclusion, I want to recommend both of these Timberwolf bandsaw blades for use with your Accu-Slice and Accu-Wedge system. Both of these blades are 3/4 inch wide. Both the metal cutting blade, which is a variable 10 to 14 teeth per inch, and the Timberwolf wood cutting blade, which is 14 teeth per inch. Both of these blades 3/4 inches wide, and they'll give you nice clean cuts for use with your Accu-Wedge to give you perfect segments for your segmented wood turning projects.